Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 8 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by India's former National Security Advisor M.K. Narayanan. In this column, the writer is calling upon India to take the cybersecurity threats posed by China seriously by first acknowledging the threats being posed to India's national security and critical infrastructure through China's cyber espionage and cyber warfare campaigns, and then to adequately gear up to counter these threats being posed by China. See, in the last few weeks, we have covered in detail the alleged cyber attacks from China against India's power sector and port facilities. See, this story broke out in the New York Times, and it has been claimed that since last year, for several months, around 10 Indian power sector organizations and 2 Indian port facilities were brought under a well-organized cyber attack, and reportedly these attacks were carried out by using a network infrastructure known as Axiomatica Symptote. It is widely believed that these servers and this network infrastructure is connected to a highly secretive cyber activity group known as Red Echo. Intelligence agencies around the world believe that the Red Echo group is connected to Chinese security agencies such as the Ministry of State Security and the People's Liberation Army. In these attacks, a malware known as ShadowPad was used by the Red Echo group, and it was essentially a backdoor Trojan malware which creates a secret path from a targeted system to a command and control server in order to extract classified information and to provide remote control through which the attackers can interfere with the functioning of the targeted computer systems. Reportedly, these attacks started taking place roughly around the same time that India and China were locked in a tense military standoff in the Ladakh sector, and they reportedly continued for several months, targeting sensitive government infrastructure, critical infrastructure of the country, and as well as defense organizations. Now, India is not new to such kind of cyber attacks emanating from China, because in the past as well, India had been targeted by China-linked cybersecurity groups under the so-called Operation Ghostnet and Operation Shady Rat cyber espionage campaigns. During these cyber attacks, which took place between 2009 and 2012, the primary target of the attacks were the computers linked to sensitive Indian government institutions, including defense organizations, intelligence agencies, and particularly the Tibetan government in exile which operates out of India. But the latest cyber attacks that have been reported have been targeted against India's critical information infrastructure, and any such large-scale attack on a country's critical information infrastructure can bring down the country to its knees. And the biggest advantage of such cyber wars and cyber espionage campaigns is that the target country could be defeated without even having to fight an actual conventional war. As these reports came out, the state government of Maharashtra acknowledged that last year's blackout in Mumbai was related to these cyber attacks originating from China. But however, the central government has denied any such allegations, and it has blamed the blackout on human error. But the evidence that has been brought out by global cybersecurity firms clearly indicates that the recent disruption in the operation of few power grids and ports in India is attributed to a possible cyber attack originating from China. So this, according to the writer, highlights the grave threat posed by China's cyber warfare and cyber espionage campaigns to India's national security. As the writer points out, there are absolutely no limitations for China when it comes to picking a target with regard to cyber warfare and cyber espionage. And of late, it is even believed that China-linked cyber activity groups have targeted the COVID-19 vaccine research going on around the world, including the distribution chain of the COVID-19 vaccines. Through similar campaigns, China-linked cyber activity groups have often targeted Western governments as well, and this goes on to highlight the advanced hybrid warfare capabilities of Chinese security forces. Then the writer goes on to point out that it's not just China which has built up such advanced cyber warfare capabilities, but even other major powers such as the United States, Russia, and Israel, also have built up similar capabilities that can unleash a devastating cyber attack on a target country, which could cripple the country's critical information infrastructure. Take, for example, how the United States reportedly developed the Stuxnet malware by working with Israel to target Iran's nuclear centrifuge facilities in order to derail Iran's nuclear weapons program. Then it has also been widely reported that several Western software companies and social media firms have deliberately created vulnerabilities in their platforms to allow the US security and intelligence agencies to exploit these vulnerabilities as a backdoor to target other countries whenever required. It is believed that American agencies such as the CIA and the NSA have an arrangement with large software companies and social media firms that have global domination, such as Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, etc. And through such collaboration, reportedly deliberate vulnerabilities have been created in their software products so that American agencies could exploit them as and when required. Then even Russia has been very aggressive in its cyber warfare and cyber espionage program, and there was widespread allegations that Russian agencies had directly interfered with the 2016 US presidential elections. Then also look at how Ukraine's power sector was brought down in 2016 through a malware attack known as Petya, and reportedly this was a part of Russia's cyber warfare against Ukraine as the country was dealing with a civil war. Now all these reported instances make it very clear that India does face a credible threat from the advanced cyber warfare capabilities of several major powers, and amongst all of them, the threat posed by China stands out because the current state of bilateral relations makes it very clear that China looks at India as a hostile, antagonistic country. Over the last couple of decades, China has made its global ambitions very clear, and it's not only looking to challenge the global hegemony of the United States in geopolitics, but it's also looking to reshape the world order, and any country that doesn't fall in line with China's world order would become a target for the Chinese state. So the growing defense and strategic relations between India and US has naturally made India a target for China, and it's important to note that in its latest defense budget of $209 billion, China has allocated a special weightage to further enhance its cyber warfare capabilities. So keeping all these factors in mind, India can no longer ignore the cybersecurity threat that emanates from China, and it can't remain complicit by ignoring the extent of threat being posed. And hence the writer argues that it's very essential for India to acknowledge any such cybersecurity related incidents. And with that acknowledgement, it's very essential to gear up India's cyber warfare capabilities as well to counter and deter any such attacks on India's critical infrastructure. India has already made sufficient progress in this regard by establishing dedicated institutions such as CERT-IN, the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, the Defense Cyber Agency, and all these institutions have the mandate to defend India's cyberspace and to step up India's capabilities in the domain of cybersecurity, cyber warfare, and cyber espionage. But however, the multiplicity of institutions and the lack of a clear-cut policy with inadequate budget has made India completely unprepared to deal with the extent of cybersecurity threat being posed from China. Hence, the writer is calling upon India to not underestimate the cybersecurity threat that comes from China, and he is asking the Indian government to take immediate steps to step up India's cyber warfare capabilities. Now let's take up a related column from page number 9, which talks about India's need for a future-ready armed force in order to fight the wars of the future. See, war by definition is nothing but organized violence at its very core. This organized violence is often used as a tool by sovereign governments to achieve political objectives, which includes defending the sovereignty and the integrity of the nation. So war is essentially a tool available to governments to establish peace or to enforce peace through domination. But in case of traditional and conventional wars, it was much more easier to define as to what exactly is a war or a conflict. Because in a traditional conventional war, you can clearly identify as to who the enemy is, you can identify those who are fighting, and you could even easily identify the theater of conflict and the front at which you're fighting. Then a traditional conventional war is defined by the concepts of jurisdiction and sovereignty, and it's much more easier to fight such conventional wars because you expect the enemy to behave logically and act in a rational manner, and it's any day easier to gear up your armed forces to deal with such traditional conventional threats. But today, the very nature of warfare has evolved and changed completely, and we already find ourselves in the midst of a futuristic war. In the wars of the future, it's very difficult to quantify these aspects because under modern warfare, which is also termed as hybrid warfare, fourth generation warfare, contactless warfare, etc., it's much more difficult and in some cases almost impossible to exactly identify as to who the enemy is. And in many cases, the enemy or the hostile entity could remain entirely anonymous. In today's world of non-linear warfare, it's much more difficult to define the traditional concepts of jurisdiction and sovereignty, and it's even difficult to pinpoint as to where exactly the conflict is taking place. In many cases of modern warfare, the enemy or the hostile entity might have already unleashed the war, and the target country might not even be aware of it. Because this futuristic war is driven by technology, especially emerging and critical technologies, and the armed forces of today are gearing up to be driven by AI or artificial intelligence. And we are already looking at the possibility of the man autonomous machine combination operating seamlessly in a network centric environment and through platforms such as drones, robots, unmanned autonomous weapon systems, accompanied with the usage of big data and cyber warfare options. Both the state and the non state actors have managed to redefine the very nature of warfare. When you club such emerging and critical technologies with tactics such as covert proxy wars, the demarcation between state and non state actors becomes very thin. And in such a network centric warfare environment driven by autonomous machines and autonomous weapon platforms, it becomes nearly impossible to define as to who the enemy is and where the conflict is going on. Because in such hybrid non-linear wars, you can't apply the traditional concepts of jurisdiction, sovereignty, and you can't expect the hostile entity to behave logically or rationally. So, to fight these wars of the future and to gear up for the future threats, you need a future ready armed force. And even India as well is trying to catch up with the other countries. For example, the recent creation of the post of the Chief of Defence Staff is seen as a major defense reform in order to help modernize the armed forces and enable the armed forces to not just deal with traditional conventional threats, but also to deal with the emerging hybrid threats in the era of contactless non-linear warfare. Through several defense reforms, India has been trying to speed up the acquisition of modern defense platforms that are based on such emerging technologies, and India is seen to be stepping up its cyber and AI capabilities with regard to modern day warfare. But compared to other major powers such as China, Russia, United States, and the others, India is still way behind the curve. And this is where India needs to start focusing on the confluence of technology with the traditional military concepts and military doctrines. And to be completely geared up for this future, the Indian Armed Forces will have to adopt all the modern technology. And this can be facilitated only through faster decision making, especially with regard to defense modernization and defense acquisition. Through a series of defense reforms, India has speeded up defense acquisition through its defense procurement policy, and of late there is greater focus on defense indigenization under the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative. Plus, future ready war-fighting institutions are being set up, such as the Defense Cyber Agency, the Defense Space Agency, and the armed forces are seen to be closely working with scientific institutions such as DRDO to promote the wider adoption of AI driven weapon platforms. And to effectively fight these wars of the future, what is needed is not just the faster adoption of emerging technology, but also the adoption of newer military strategies and military doctrines. then more importantly, it becomes very important in a hybrid warfare environment to break the silos between the civilian leadership and the military leadership. Currently, as far as the traditional and conventional warfare domains are concerned, there is a huge jurisdictional divide between the civilian bureaucracy and the military bureaucracy, and turf wars or jurisdictional wars between these two arms of the government are quite common. But this divide between the civilian leadership and the military leadership is not affordable in a hybrid warfare environment, and hence it's very essential for the government and as well as for the armed forces to break these silos that divide the civilian and the military leadership. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 8, which examines the rising retail inflation in the Indian economy. See, recently, the National Statistical Office brought out the CPI inflation data for the month of February. And according to this retail inflation data, CPI based inflation for the month of February stood at 5.03%, which is a 3-month high as far as retail inflation is concerned. In comparison, for the previous month, retail inflation stood at 4.06%, and this represents a jump of almost 100 basis points in retail inflation. So, considering this significant jump in retail inflation in a single month, the editorial argues that the RBI and the government should focus on price stability, especially considering the fact that retail inflation is primarily being driven by food inflation and fuel inflation. If you look at the CPI data for the last 2 months, it becomes very clear that protein-based food items such as pulses, edible oils, meat, fish, and egg, they have all registered double-digit inflation. Within the basket of goods that are considered under CPI, food and beverages alone account for 54.2% of the weightage, and retail inflation in this category has jumped by nearly 160 basis points from January to February. Then upon this, fuel prices have also been shooting up consistently, and this in turn has a direct impact on the costs involved in transportation and communication. Especially the steady rise in diesel prices is going to have a direct impact on freight charges and logistics, and this in turn will again increase food inflation, especially in critical categories. This inflation in fuel prices is expected to continue and go up further because the global oil prices have shot up, and in the last 3 months, Brent crude oil futures have gone up by nearly 40%. This sudden rise in global oil prices is directly attributed to the decision of the oil producing nations under the OPEC Plus grouping to continue with their production cuts, which was imposed last year to deal with the impact of the pandemic. So considering these factors, it's very important for India's policy makers to ensure that the country's monetary policy is firmly focused on inflation containment. The Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI, which comes out with the country's monetary policy and which determines the key policy rate, that is the repo rate, will have to ensure that inflation targeting remains the primary focus as laid out in the monetary policy framework. In the monetary policy framework that has been adopted by the RBI, the Monetary Policy Committee, headed by the RBI governor, has been mandated to target inflation at around 4% with a margin of plus or minus 2%. So as per the monetary policy framework, the acceptable range for inflation is within 2 to 6%, and the ongoing price stability in the Indian economy threatens to breach this target, which could further significantly affect several other macroeconomic factors. It's crucial even for the government to ensure that its policies are focused on price control, especially in food and fuel prices. And in the conflict between growth and inflation, it's very important for the policymakers at RBI and the government to shift focus towards inflation control and inflation targeting, because since the last 1 year, the monetary policy had been relaxed to revive growth in the economy, which had stagnated as a result of the pandemic and the impact of the lockdown. While the relaxed monetary policy was justified, considering the unprecedented circumstances created by the pandemic, the time has come for the policy makers to shift their attention towards inflation targeting and price stability in the larger interest of the overall health of the economy, even at the cost of compromising a little on growth. Now let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question. It would be a grievous error if India were to underestimate the extent of the cyber threat it faces, especially from China. Elucidate. The second question. Evaluate the changing nature of modern day warfare and how can India prepare for it? Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes the discussion for today. Thanks for watching.